Good morning, friends. As we close out the week, let's return to Matthew chapter 8, verses 21 and 22, and do our best to address something we weren't able to get to this past Sunday. You'll remember that Jesus is being approached by a couple of men who wish to accompany him across the Sea of Galilee, and therefore presumably join his retinue of somewhat more official disciples, I suppose you could say. So in verse 21 we read, "Another of the disciples said to him, 'Lord, let me first go and bury my father.' And Jesus said to him, 'Follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead.'" Now, there is some disagreement on this passage as a whole on the part of theologians. On Sunday, I mentioned that there are cultural considerations to take into account, and that the idea of the man saying, "Let me first go and bury my father," could easily have been a cultural idiom, where his father had not just literally died, but that he was simply communicating his sense of responsibility to his father to take care of him in his older age. And a general sense of responsibility to one's parents is both honoring to the Lord and commendable as an act of obedience. However, in this current situation, according to this understanding, which I do hold with some confidence, but according to this current situation, then, the man is presenting that family commitment as a reason why he cannot commit himself fully to Jesus. And that, of course, is where things go off the rails. Because as we've seen from the scripture, this past Sunday as well as throughout this week, anything that would actually prevent us from fully committing to Christ is not a good thing and must be disregarded for Christ's sake. It has become an idol, something that is preventing us from actually going to the true God, to Christ. And if that means choosing between Christ and a family member, well, we must choose Christ. And when we take that into consideration, we see that the cost of discipleship is indeed high. Now, before we go on to consider what Jesus meant by saying leave the dead to bury their own dead, let's remember that the literal circumstances of this encounter are far different than what we have today. Because Jesus is literally and physically on the earth at this time, and so following Jesus had a literal and physical quality to it back then that it doesn't have today. To follow Jesus as he taught and as he healed throughout the towns of Galilee and down to Judea and everything, to follow the earthly ministry of Christ was by necessity to physically move from place to place with him. That is not the case now. And so we don't need to fear the idea that Jesus is telling us that when we come to him, then we need to stop paying attention to unbelieving family members, because the requirement is not the same today. We are not following Jesus physically from place to place in a manner which would lead us to have to say, "Sorry, Mom, sorry, Dad, I can't come over and help you today because I'm following Jesus." That's not really the issue. At the same time, however, we are reminded that if an unbelieving family member is trying to get you to choose between them and God, between them and Christ's calling on your life, or simply trying to get you to choose between them and regular fellowship with God's family, the church, then that is a point where you choose God and the things of God over unbelieving family members. But again, that doesn't mean you abandon that family member altogether, because you still have opportunities to share the gospel with them and to explain why it is so important that you be in corporate worship, that you pray with your brothers and sisters, that you study the Bible along with them. Explain why you're making the choice that you're making and share the gospel, encouraging them to make that same choice. Because this leads us into why Jesus said, "Leave the dead to bury their own dead." And again, a moment ago I mentioned that there was some differences of opinions, difference of thoughts regarding this passage from the scholars and theologians, and there's some disagreements as to what Jesus is really trying to communicate here. But I think that there's one basic principle that does come through loud and strong, and that is that when you consider following Christ versus not following Christ, then you are considering the difference between a kingdom of life and a kingdom of death. You are considering joining those who have a spiritual life versus staying with those who are spiritually dead. And that is a vast distinction, because when you go from death to life, obviously everything changes. You now have infinitely more in common with others who are also spiritually alive than you do with those who are spiritually dead, even if those spiritually dead people happen to be members of your own biological family that you grew up with. Again, this doesn't mean you stop loving those people. It doesn't mean that you are all of a sudden apathetic toward them or anything like that. But we must understand as Christians, as followers of Christ, that we live in an entirely different world than those who do not have Christ, who are not living by faith in the God of light and life. In fact, this is one of the reasons why God tells us that Christians should never marry, nor in any other way significantly bind themselves to non-Christians. Because what fellowship does light have with darkness, says the scriptures? The two are just so fundamentally and absolutely different and incompatible in that sense of intimate fellowship. It cannot happen. And so I believe, at least at the very basic level, the reason why Jesus says, leave the dead to bury their own dead, is so that the would-be disciple in question here would sort of receive a spiritual slap to the face to wake him up to the reality of what it means to follow Christ. That if you do truly follow Christ, which obviously requires regeneration and salvation, then you are living in an entirely different world with entirely different priorities from that of the world of the dead. And of course, our primary ministry is to that dead world, but our absolute priority is to the Master of life. And then he is the one who dictates that ministry to the dead and what it looks like and when and where it takes place. And in this case, Jesus wanted this man to understand clearly the difference. His commitment, the man's commitment, if he were to truly follow Christ, is not Christ one among many. Nor is it Christ first with many other obligations following close behind as ordered and organized by the man's own priority system. No, to follow Christ means to have not a list of priorities with Christ at the top. No, to follow Christ means to have a singular priority, one priority, one item on the list, so to speak, and that is Christ himself and him alone. And then Christ, according to his priority system, lays out the obligations he wants us to tend to, which will include things like family members and such, but it will all be according to his will and his pattern of organization and not our own. He is the master, we are the servants, such that when we obey him in this way, it will lead us to share the gospel with our family members. It will lead us to just helping our aging parents out around the house or whatever it might be, but it will be an activity that is actually fulfilling the priority of obeying Christ. So when we follow Jesus, everything changes. Who we perceive to be in charge of our lives changes. Priorities drastically change. What we have in common with people changes. And all of it is now geared toward life rather than death, and it is laid out for us by Christ rather than ourselves. With that in mind, I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I'll see you soon.